Today, I want to talk to you guys about this lot, the British royal family, the monarchy, and whether it's right that today in the 21st century, here in Britain, we are ruled over by an unelected head of state, as opposed to being a republic where we would democratically elect our head of state or, not have a head of state at all and just have a democratically elected parliament. Hello, welcome to The Attic. My name's Mark Jago. I'm a philosophy professor in the UK. So today we are discussing monarchy versus republicanism. So yeah, for those of you out there in the world who don't know, here in Britain, in the 21st century, we still have our royal family, we still have the monarchy, the Queen is the head of state, she inherited that position because she is the Queen, she wasn't elected to that position, she didn't win that position or anything like that. We are still a democracy in the UK in the sense that we elect our parliament, well, at least some of it, we elect the House of Commons, but that house and all of our parliament is subject to the Queen. The Queen is the head of state. She is top of all of it. Now, some people will tell you that, that doesn't really matter because in practice she doesn't have that much power. We're going to talk about that in the video. So if that sounds good to you, before we get going, you guys can do me a favour, give this video a big old thumbs up. That helps me reach more people on YouTube. And if you haven't already, why not subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to get updates. So this question of the monarchy has come into quite sharp focus recently, largely because of this guy. Yep, it's Prince Andrew, allegedly best buddy of convicted child sex offence terrible person Jeffrey Epstein. Okay, I don't want to talk specifically about this guy or any one particular person in this video. I think it's pretty clear that he is a terrible human being, but some people say, oh, it's just, one bad apple in the barrel. I don't know the private lives of the royals, obviously. I don't know how many of them are great people or terrible people. And, as far as I'm concerned, even if they are all, apart from him, really great people, which is probably unlikely, but even if it were the case, I still wouldn't care because there is some problem with the monarchy that goes much deeper than whether they are, on their own individually, good or bad people. There's also an awful lot of debate out there over the finances of the royal family of the monarchy, right? Arguments about do we pay their way as taxpayers? Why should we do that? They are super wealthy individuals and yet loads of taxpayers' money, loads of state money goes to them running their houses and moving around the country and stuff like that. Why should we do that? And then the arguments come the other way, like saying, but they bring in loads of money through tourism and stuff like that. And, lots of arguments over monarchy get sucked into this issue about who pays for it? Do they pay for themselves? So there's a really great video out there from Sean on his YouTube channel debunking the idea that the royal family bring in more money through tourism than we pay out as taxpayers to look after them. Okay, so he's debunking that idea. I think that's a really valuable video, so I suggest you go and watch that. But, that is not what I'm interested in here, because even if it turned out that the royal family brought in loads of money through tourism and cost us taxpayers nothing, which isn't true, but even if it were true, there's still a super deep problem for the idea of monarchy. And there's a third issue that these debates about the monarchy get sucked into often, and that's the issue of wealth inequality, okay? How is it that these people have so much wealth? Not because they've earned it or because they deserve it, just because of the position they're born into. Okay, now that is a problem. It's deeply unfair that our society is so financially unequal, and that creates huge social and cultural problems right throughout society. But, that's not a problem that is limited to the royal family. There is inequality all over the place due to our social structure, due to capitalism, due to all kinds of things, okay? So that's not the problem that I'm going to be focusing in on today. Because, even if we lived in a totally financially equal society with a royal family and a monarch as head of state, there would still be this deep problem. And that's the problem that I want to focus on. And the problem is this. In a fair and equal democracy, nobody should be above the law. But the monarchy are above the law. So that's the issue I want to focus on today. Why do I think that is such an important principle, that nobody should be above the law? Well, basically because that's what it is to be a democracy. Being a democracy doesn't just mean that we get to vote for politicians every 4 or 5 years or whatever, okay? What it means is that we, the people, get a say in how our country is governed and what the laws are that govern us. Those laws shouldn't be arbitrarily imposed by people with power. We get a say in what those laws are. Now, it wouldn't be practical for every time we need to decide on a law for everyone in the country, like 70 whatever it is billion people, to get together and decide yes or no or hold a referendum or whatever. So typically the way we do things here and in other democracies is we elect our representatives, various different ways of doing that. In the UK, we have a first past the post system. Those electives serve in Parliament. They decide on what the laws are going to be on our behalf. And here's the really important principle. They get to decide the laws, but they don't get to be above the law, okay? If they set a certain law, that law applies to everyone, okay? So if it's a law about, what the speed limit's going to be, they've got to abide by the speed limit. If it's a law about taxation or business interests or whatever, they've still got to abide by it, okay? So even though they are making the laws, they are making it in our interests, not in their interests. That law should apply to them just as much as it applies to us, the people. And importantly, if any of those people making the laws or deciding on the laws, politicians, judges or whatever, have a conflict of interest, that is to say, they've got some interest in the outcome of that procedure, they've got to declare it, they've got to step aside. Now, obviously that doesn't always happen, but that is the way that it is meant to happen. And that is one of the founding principles of running a democratic society. Nobody is above the law. But here in the UK, with our monarchy, we've got a royal family who, by and large, on certain issues, are above the law. So that is what I want to get to. Okay, so before I get on to the specific cases, I want to just clarify a few points about what I mean by nobody is being above the law, about being above the law. In the UK, and in any kind of sensible society, we are going to have various exceptions to the law. Okay, so take a really simple case. We have speed limits. That's a good thing that we have speed limits. On the motorway, it's 70 miles an hour in the UK. But we have exceptions to that, like if there's a fire and there's a fire engine racing to it to put it out, they're allowed to drive faster than 70 miles an hour if it's safe to do so. Okay, makes perfectly good sense. It's in everyone's interest that that fire engine gets to the fire quickly as possible. They've got drivers who are well trained in driving safely at higher speeds. And importantly, those drivers can only go faster than that speed limit when they're racing to a fire and they're signalling it with their blues and twos, right? They can't just drive fast whenever they want to if they want to get home for dinner quickly or whatever. It has to be specific cases that are in the public interest that kicks in that exception to the law. So sometimes there are perfectly well motivated exceptions to the law. That's not what I'm talking about today. Second issue that comes up is sometimes people do get away with breaking the law. Obviously, right? Some people literally or figuratively get away with murder. And often we seem to see correlations between people getting away with breaking the law and wealth and power. Rich, wealthy, socially privileged, typically white men seem to get away with breaking the law a lot more often than, poor black people. So obviously that is a massive, massive social issue. But again, that's not the issue I'm talking about here. Yeah, people sometimes get away with breaking the law, but still, in the eyes of the law, they've done something wrong. But then it's a further issue whether the state has the power and the ambition to get hold of that person, try them, and find them guilty. What I want to focus in on here today is people for whom the law didn't apply in the first place, people who get a free pass in the eyes of the law. So it's not just that they don't get caught and brought to justice, it's that according to the law, they never did anything wrong in the first place because they were placed above the law. Now, this is when we get on to the royal family. In the UK, we have a parliamentary procedure called Queen's Consent, or King's Consent, depending on whether you've got a king or a queen on the throne at the time. So what is Queen's Consent? Well, it's a procedure whereby when Parliament are trying to enact new legislation, the Queen needs to get contacted first. She or her lawyers will be shown a draft of the legislation, and she gets a period of time to comment on it. So she looks at it, she comments on it, and gets the right to make some suggestions about how the legislation should be changed. This applies in theory to any new bit of legislation going through UK Parliament. Now already this is starting to sound a little bit dubious, giving one individual the chance to see proposed new bits of legislation and then tinker with it, pretty much to suit themselves. That sounds very, very dubious. However, according to a lot of people, we shouldn't worry about this because it's a pure formality. It's kind of a hangover from the days of monarchy, when the monarchy had real power over Parliament. But you know, they don't have any real political power anymore. It's just a pure formality. Parliament sends new legislation over to the palace gives a nod, and through it goes, and we're all good and happy. That's how we're told it goes. So, for instance, when asked about this, a spokesperson for the Queen said that Queen's consent is purely formal. Consent is always granted by the monarch where requested by government. Got that? Always. And similarly, the Cabinet Office, a department of the government, they say that Queen's consent is routinely sought by the government and agreed by the monarch as a matter of course. It's a matter of course, okay? So the government asks the Queen automatically says, yeah, of course you can change the law like that. No problem, I'm not going to interfere. That's how we're told it goes. But actually, if you look at the facts, they paint a rather different story. So now I'm going to turn to those facts, which have been uncovered recently by various journalistic investigations. These were all published recently in The Guardian. A lot of this stuff sounds barely believable, so I'm going to be linking to the results of these investigations, linking to the facts so you can check it out for yourself. So let's start back in the 60s, 1967. A new law is going through Parliament which gives tenants in houses, people who don't own their house with the freehold, the right to buy that house from their landlords, to change the lease from leasehold to freehold. And that in effect means that they would be able to buy the house and pass it on to their children, because under their present arrangements they can live in the house but they can't pass it on. The house is effectively for them worthless on their death. But the Duchy of Cornwall, that is Prince Charles's gig, gets whiff of this, and they think to themselves, we own a lot of houses. If this law goes through and applies to us, we're going to have to sell a lot of these houses, and that means we won't be able to get the rental income year in, year out for nothing, basically. So what happened? Well, the Duchy of Cornwall, via the Queen, made various suggestions for changes to this bill. What do you think those changes were? Well, when the legislation came out, it came out pretty much as intended, except the Duchy of Cornwall were exempt from it. Okay, so the law was put into place, and it applied to everyone, all the landlords, all over the place, apart from Prince Charles. He literally was above that law. Let's move on to 1973. A wealth transparency bill is going through Parliament. The idea is to make it easier to find out who owns what. It's not always easy to find out who owns shares in big multinational corporations. The idea of this bill was to make all that stuff more transparent, to link ownership of wealth and shares and all that business to particular businesses and individuals. The Queen got whiff of this, or rather her lawyers did, and thought to themselves, well, hang on, our Queen owns rather a lot of this stuff, which nobody really knows about. We kind of don't know how much wealth the Queen has because they've never disclosed it. And the lawyers thought to themselves, it might be embarrassing if it gets out exactly what the Queen owns, how much, but also what she owns. And this kind of suggests that perhaps she had some shares in companies that might be a bit dodgy, and you wouldn't want the public knowing that our beloved Queen owns shares in that kind of dubious stuff. So what do you think happened? Well, there was a protracted period of discussion between the government and the Queen's lawyers, and the Queen's lawyers basically said, we need to give consent to this, and we might not. So the government went back, thought again, and changed the legislation. Or rather, they changed to whom it might apply. And they were kind of a bit clever about this. They didn't just say, oh, it applies to everyone apart from our beloved Queen. They changed the legislation so that it wouldn't apply to certain high-worth individuals. And there was a list of them, basically heads of state and things like this. But it's pretty obvious that the intended exemptions were to our beloved Queenie. So when that became law in 1976, after the next general election, literally the Queen was exempt from that wealth transparency law. She was literally above that law. 1975, there's going to be new legislation about how land is leased. So landowners can often lease that land for commercial enterprise to build on it or whatever. Rather than selling it, you would lease it. And the new law said that to do this, landowners would have to go via local authorities to basically standardise prices and make it fair. Queen owns lots of land, often leases it out to developers and whatnot. Kind of thought, well, if we do that, we might not be able to make quite as much money out of it. So, what do you think they did? Well, they had a little word with the government, and the government fiddled things around, and the legislation comes out, and guess who's exempt from the new legislation? Yep, you've got it. Crown lands. So every landowner in the country who wants to lease land out commercially has to abide by this legislation. Unless you happen to be the Queen, and then you don't. She literally is above that law. Let's move on to 2006. The government's putting through new legislation on animal rights, which will allow inspectors the right to enter private property to check on animal rights. Now, the Queen owns a lot of land and probably doesn't want inspectors poking around it, so you can guess what happened. She has a quiet word with the government. The government changed the legislation basically to say, same as before, every bit of land in the country is subject to this rule that animal rights inspectors can come onto it to check the welfare of animals. Unless you happen to be the Queen, your land is exempt. If you're an animal rights inspector, you can go onto any bit of land in the country unless it's Crown land. You can't go on that. She is literally above that law. 2017 Cultural Property Act. So this is a bit of legislation to do with armed conflict and cultural items that are purloined, stolen, taken from theatres of war. And part of it is about tracing things that have historically been taken from areas of war. Okay, so the idea would be that investigators can go onto your property and check out, have you got any of these things from this list that maybe, you shouldn't have bought or you shouldn't have got hold of because they were stolen from this country during a time of war. Now, I'm not saying that the Queen does that and that she has loads of these artifacts. Like, nobody knows because nobody can actually check. Because when this legislation came out, there was an exemption to it. You've guessed it. Inspectors can go and inspect all over the country looking for these cultural items that have been taken from theatres of war, apart from on Crown land. You're not allowed to go there because the Queen is literally above this law. And there is loads and loads and loads of examples of this, okay? And these all came about through this principle of Queen's consent, okay? So new legislation was coming out. The Queen or her lawyers looked at it, thought, oh, we don't really like that. Could you just make a few amendments to it, basically to make the Queen or Prince Charles or whoever exempt? Just a couple more examples. Wills in the UK are public documents. That means when you write your will, it's sealed to your death, but after that, anyone, any member of the public can go and look at it. And that's a way of checking that what you actually did put in your will actually happened after your death, right? So if you leave all your money or whatever to a certain person, but it doesn't go to that person, anyone has the right to go and check to see that justice was done. Unless you're a member of the royal family. If you're a member of the royal family, your wills are forever sealed. The public aren't allowed scrutiny of them. Why would they not want that? Well, basically because they talk about the wealth that the royal family has, and they're really funny about it. They've got all this wealth, but they don't want British subjects, or anyone for that matter, to know how much they've got. I guess they kind of find it embarrassing to think about just how rich they are, kind of through no desert of their own. I mean, that's kind of a different subject, so, let's not go there today. Point is, there is this law that applies to everyone in the country. Everyone's will is a public matter. Unless you're a member of the royal family, Those people are literally above that law. Final example I want to talk about today. This one's interesting to me because it's about the environment, but also because it's about the mismatch between the public persona of the royal family and what they actually do in practice. So the royal family, lots of them have come out in defence of the environment. Prince Charles has spoken publicly for many years about the need to manage our environment in a sustainable way. Other members of the royal family have given time and publicity to campaigns for environmental issues. That's all part of their public persona. But let's have a look at what actually happens when it concerns their own money in private. 2021, just last year, a new bit of legislation is going through the Scottish Parliament concerning renewable energy on privately owned land. Basically, the idea is when a private landowner has a bunch of houses on their land, like they're renting them out or whatever, you would be able to heat those in a renewable way as a cluster rather than doing it individually. So it would be doing it as a cluster is much more efficient, better for the environment, less carbon. And to do that, you often have to run pipes from one to the other across the privately owned land. And the point of the legislation was to require private landowners to allow this. The Queen is one of the largest landowners in Scotland, and maybe at some point thought to herself, or her lawyers did, not sure we want to be required to put pipes across our land. I mean, maybe we will, maybe we won't, but we don't want to be told what to do. So they campaigned for an exemption to this piece of legislation. You can actually read all the transcripts to this to see how it came about, but basically there was discussions in the Scottish Parliament, basically with the Energy Minister saying, I don't think we can get this through Parliament unless we make some concessions to the Queen's lawyers. So they fiddled about a bit with the legislation, basically bringing it out exactly as it was intended, but with an exemption, making the Queen's Scottish land exempt. It was literally an exemption just for the Queen. She is literally above that law. And, this one really got to me perhaps more than some of the other ones because, the royal family, the Queen, they have this public persona of being responsible towards the environment, campaigning for, climate change charities and things like that. And yet in private, they are campaigning with their lawyers against initiatives over renewable energy on their own land. Okay, so how much does any of this really matter? I guess there's going to be people out there who say, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying, but no big deal. It's not Russia invading Ukraine. It's not the Nazis. It's not the Holocaust. It's not the worst thing in the world. Totally, absolutely, I agree. It's not the worst thing in the world. And perhaps none of these particular interventions in the law really affect that many people that strongly. Although I think some of them do affect some people quite strongly. It's really about the point of principle. Do we live in a democracy where everybody is subject to the laws? Those laws that we, as a democracy, contribute to through our elected representatives. Or is it the case that those laws apply to us, but not to the people who make the laws, not to our unelected head of state? It really does look like that in this case. That purely in virtue of who your parents were, you get to inherit this position of head of state, unelected and perhaps undeserved, and that gives you the right in law to fiddle the laws, to give yourself this little exemption, to put yourself above the law that applies to everyone else. Where you have a system that allows for that, even if it's not actually done that much, where it is permissible, it's not a genuine democracy. There is something wrong democratically with that system. In giving a head of state those powers, we are taking away from us. We are taking away from our democratic rights. So I think that is a really powerful reason for favouring a republic. That is a democratically elected parliament with a written constitution over and above an unelected head of state, a monarchy or whatever. Okay guys, thank you so much for listening this far. I really appreciate it. If you want to do me a favour, give this video a big old thumbs up. That really helps me out. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button if you want to get updates. There's loads and loads of issues that we could discuss here. If you've got any questions, things you want to talk about, leave me a comment below. I really enjoy replying to those. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to see you back on Attic Philosophy soon.